Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. I'm Arjuna, and this is the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today I've got two neuroscientists on, and we'll be discussing, we'll be discussing consciousness and the brain, and I think this will be a very interesting discussion. Michael Egnor, of course, he's been on a few times, and he's put a lot of thought into the subject, and Mark Solms has spent a lot of his career studying this, and he's written a book called, what's it called again?
The Hidden Spring.
I got halfway through it, and I wish I'd started it sooner so I could finish it in time, but it was a fascinating book. Michael Egnor just described it as one of the best popular level books on neuroscience he's ever read. So thanks for coming on, Mark and Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, good to be here.
And we'll get started by having our guests describe their views. So Mark, could you please explain your views on the brain and consciousness and physicalism?
Well, those are, you've actually asked two questions there. The one is the brain and consciousness, and another is physicalism. And each of them is a gigantic question. So let me deal with the first of the two, in other words, the brain and consciousness, and then we can come to metaphysics separately. I have been led to the view over a few decades of working in this field, that we've made a big mistake in our conception of consciousness in neuroscience. The mistake has a very long history, which I won't go into, but it boils down to the view that the seat of consciousness in the brain is the cerebral cortex. This is an absolutely universal view, with a very few, when I say absolutely universal, there are a few exceptions, myself included, obviously. But the general view amongst almost all of my colleagues is that the seat of consciousness is the cerebral cortex. This expanse of cortex that we pride ourselves as a species as having so much of it. It's our evolutionary, pride and joy. But the evidence suggests, and there's a lot of evidence, suggests that the source of consciousness in the brain is in fact in the brain stem, which is a much more ancient, much more primitive structure that we share not only with all other primates and all other mammals, but in fact with all vertebrates. We share the basic structure of the brain stem in you and me, is the same as it is in fishes. And the evidence suggests that consciousness, if you're going to look at it from the physical point of view, where in the brain, which part of the brain is bound up with this mental property that we call consciousness, it is the reticular activating system in particular of the brain stem. Its primitive core. I said there's tons of evidence, but let me just mention the most sort of dramatic bit of evidence. A very old-fashioned method in neuroscience is the lesion method. Lesion is just a fancy word for damage. So if there's damage to a part of the brain that performs a certain function, then that function should be lost. This method applied to the question of which part of the brain is responsible for consciousness. If you apply the lesion method to this question, you find that if you damage just a tiny area of the reticular core of the brain stem, roughly 2 cubic millimeters in extent, in other words, the size of a match head, then the lights go out. Consciousness is lost entirely. On the other hand, there are children who are born with absolutely no cerebral cortex, a condition called hydranencephaly. And these kids are conscious. They're conscious in the sense that they wake up in the morning and they go to sleep at night. But more interestingly, they are emotionally responsive to their environments. If something frightening happens, they are frightened. And they show feelings of fright and irritation if something frustrating happens, or joy and laughter if something happy happens. There you have it in a nutshell. These kids are conscious. There is something it is like to be them. They have qualitative experience. There's a content to their minds, and yet they have no cortex at all. So that is the most dramatic evidence for the view that I've come to. It's not by any means the only line of evidence, and with such a complex question, you wouldn't want to rely on only one method. But that, as I said, is the old-fashioned basic ABC method in behavioral neuroscience. And it shows us that there's something dramatically wrong with our idea that cortex is the seat of consciousness. So that's my starting point for our conversation tonight as far as the brain and consciousness is concerned.
And as for physicalism, I suppose one way I could put the question is, do you think the brain is completely responsible for consciousness, whether the brainstem or the whole thing is an entirety, or is there some aspect of consciousness which is perhaps fundamental, or maybe you're agnostic, to whether there's a soul or something?
So unfortunately here too, I find myself at odds with my colleagues, and it gives me no pleasure to be at odds with my colleagues because, it's lonely and you want to be liked and you want everyone to say, yep, we're all on the same side, we agree. But unfortunately, I hold a different view on that score too. I am not a physicalist in the sense of I do not believe that the mind can be reduced to material processes. I believe my position, metaphysical position, is what is commonly called dual aspect monism, associated above all others with the name of Baruch Spinoza. And that view is that, to put it in its simplest terms, when I wake up in the morning with my eyes closed and I feel myself to exist with gratitude, thank heavens, here I am, I'm Mark Solms, I'm alive, that's my mind. When I then stagger over to the bathroom and look at the mirror and see this body, I see, oh, there's Mark Solms, he's alive. And it's equally reassuring. But I don't believe that that's something else. I believe it's the same thing as I experience myself to be. I don't think they're two Mark Solmses, I think they're one. And now we have this problem. How come I have this experience called my mind of being Mark Solms, and then I have this objective physical thing called my body, which is also Mark Solms? How can they be one and the same thing? The dual aspect monist philosophy is simply that they're two different appearances, two different ways in which we can observe a single entity. The question then arises, well, then what is that single entity? And this is the point of difference with my colleagues. I don't think that the single entity is actually just my body and that my mind is somehow a function of it. I think that the single entity underlies both of them, that there's something behind or beyond the appearance of the body and the mind, which unifies them. And that's my position. I take all the data from subjective experience, which is what psychology is all about, and I take all the data from physiology and anatomy, which is what neuroscience is all about, and I see these as two different points of entry, two different sets of evidence about how this underlying thing works, this thing which we have to infer. The functional organization of this underlying entity, which you might call the apparatus of the mind or the instrument of the mind or the functional system of the mind. Those are words which people are happy to use. But the point is, it's not a matter of reducing. I think a good analogy is lightning and thunder. You see with your eyes a flash of lightning. You hear with your ears a clap of thunder. And you can't, it's a stupid question to say, how did the lightning cause the thunder? The one doesn't cause the other. They're just two different ways of registering one and the same thing. So that is my position. And I need to add one further wrinkle to this. because I'm aware that I'm talking to Michael Egnor, and that is that when it comes to what is the nature, the true nature of this underlying entity which we observe in these, which appears to us in these two different ways, I think that we have to have a bit of humility. We have to recognize that there's some things that you can't know directly, you can't experience directly. You have to recognize the limits of your capacity to know things, and I think we need a bit more of a sense of mystery in science and humility. So the true nature of the essence of the person or any other conscious creature, for that matter, I think is something we can only make guesses about. The scientific method allows us to make a systematic approach to trying to make better guesses than we made 100 years before. But there are nevertheless always going to be guesses. The closing sentence, I think, of Stephen Hawking's famous book, A Brief History of Time, is something about, eventually we're going to have a theory of everything, and then we will see the face of God. And my view is that ain't going to happen. We're never going to see the face of God.
Cool, thanks for that. And now, Michael, could you give a brief explanation of your views? A lot of people will have heard it before because you've been on a few times, but...
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure and privilege to talk with Mark. My own story, and I recommend to all the viewers to read A Hidden Spring. It's a fantastic book, and it's got a lot of truth in it. Meaning, what Mark describes about the clinical reality of neuroscience as patients experience is very true. And for example, his observation that consciousness does not reside in the cortex, every neurosurgeon knows that. I mean, that's crystal clear. And it's remarkable that so much of neuroscience doesn't know that. And so Mark is really telling the truth there. My own experience actually resembles Mark's in some way. That he mentions in his book that his brother had a head injury when he was young, and that I think inspired Mark to try to understand the mind and the brain. My mother had an aneurysm rupture when I was a young child, a brain aneurysm, and she survived it. She had surgery, but she had cognitive difficulties because of that, and so I kind of struggled with that same question as to what was going on with her mind and what was going on with her brain and how did they relate to each other. So I was fascinated by this, and of course also experienced all the emotional trauma this kind of thing raises as a child. When I was in college, I was fascinated by Freud, and I read as much of Freud as I could, interpretation of dreams, psychopathology of everyday life. And I was particularly fascinated by Freud's concept of the unconscious. And it seemed to me to be absolutely true, meaning that there really is an unconscious, and it's really a tremendous part of our lives. But I was fascinated with what could it possibly mean to have thoughts that you weren't aware of. But we do seem to have thoughts that we're not aware of. So I loved Freud. I moved away from Freud as I got older because Freud was an atheist and a materialist, and I came to see things in a different framework. But to paraphrase a statement about Napoleon, which is about Freud, is that Freud is as close to the truth about the mind that an atheist and a materialist can get, meaning that he really had very deep insights into the mind. When I got to medical school, I was thrilled at being able to study neuroscience. My first day of medical school, I bought all the textbooks for neuroscience. I read Sidman, which was a program textbook on neuroanatomy. I was fascinated by the basic ganglia. And I was really thinking that when I really studied neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, that I would understand the mind on a deeper level, not just the structure of the brain and the physiology, but what the mind was and what a person was. I thought this was the Rosetta Stone into understanding deeply what it is to be human. And I found in medical school and then in my neurosurgical training that it didn't really help that much. In fact, it was almost the other way around. I had to understand what people were and what the mind was in order to make sense of neuroscience, and I still find that. So I came to a very different perspective. I saw very much the same things that Mark wrote about in his book. I saw patients who didn't have frontal lobes, or at least most of their frontal lobes, who were completely conscious, in fact, rather pleasant, bright people. I've had children who have hydrocephaly, who are most certainly conscious. I mean, they're quite handicapped, but they have emotions. They obviously have profound mental states. I have a patient who's had most of his brain destroyed. He's a young man who had an arteriovenous malformation of his brain, hemorrhage, about 30 years ago when he was a small child, and it destroyed most of his brain. I see him in the office. He has a shunt for hydrocephalus, for fluid on his brain, and I see his family, and he can't speak very well, and he's kind of paralyzed. He sits in a wheelchair. But he's actually an extremely perceptive person. His family says that he understands other people's emotions and other people's thoughts, and better than most people do. He's a very perceptive person. I've got a young girl who's missing at least half of her brain, including a lot of her frontal cortex, who just recently graduated from high school as an honor student. She's a brilliant child, perfectly normal kid. So what Mark says is completely true, that consciousness certainly doesn't come from the cortex. Where it comes from is a whole other fascinating question. But I found that what's in the neuroscience textbook simply doesn't match up to real everyday experience. Another very good example of that is a number of years ago, I was removing a tumor in the frontal lobe of a woman who had an invasive astrocytoma. And it involved removing most of her left frontal lobe. And we had to do it under local anesthesia with brain mapping so we could identify her speech area. So as we were removing this tumor, I was talking with her because she was awake under the surgical drapes. And she would ask things like, "What's that sound?" And I didn't want to tell her that's your brain going up a sucker or something, So but I thought it's so odd that I'm talking to this woman whose frontal lobe I'm taking out as I'm talking to her, and she never turned a hair. She was completely normal before the surgery and after the surgery and during the surgery. So the brain is a funny thing, and where consciousness is, I have my own views. My views are a little more radical than Mark's, but along the same line. Certainly not in the cortex. What I've come to believe is a couple things. One is that Roger Scruton was a philosopher, I think summed up neuroscience beautifully in a single sentence when he said, and I paraphrase, neuroscience is a vast trove of answers with no memory of the questions. And that really nails it. That is, that there's so much that has been discovered in neuroscience, but so many neuroscientists aren't even aware of the questions they're asking. They're not really getting to the heart of the issue. My own view has been in studying Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas that the Aristotelian-Thomistic model of the mind fits my experience remarkably well. That is that the soul, which is what makes a body alive, contains powers, some of which we call the mind. And these powers include vegetative powers, like things like respiration, heart rate, and things like that. It includes sensitive powers, what Aristotle would refer to as perception, emotion, memory, imagination, and locomotion. And it contains rational powers, which is the ability to comprehend abstract concepts and free will that follows on that. And that the human soul is the composite of all these powers, but that the vegetative powers and the sensitive powers are in the brain, but the intellectual powers are not material. They're influenced by the brain, but we have an immaterial aspect to our souls. What I think is an extremely fascinating insight was a question that Aristotle asked, and that is, what is a precept? What is a perception? And St. Thomas followed up on this. And their answer was that, for example, when I'm looking at a tree, the tree is not my perception. The tree is that which I perceive, but the perception is that by which I perceive. That is, a perception is the instrument by which we perceive. And the thing perceived is actually the thing itself. It's the form of the tree that I perceive. And St. Thomas pointed out that perceptions are not conscious. We're not aware of them. We're aware of the objects of our perceptions, but not of the perception itself. And also conception. That is, we are aware of the objects of what we conceive. If I'm thinking about justice, I'm aware of justice, but I'm not aware of the concept of justice, which is the means by which I can conceive of justice. And this notion that perceptions and conceptions are not conscious things, I think fits beautifully with the Freudian idea of the id. That is, that the id is that by which we perceive reality. But reality is reality. What we perceive are the real things out there, the trees and the concepts. And the id is the instrument by which we perceive them. And we're not aware of the instrument, just like we're not routinely aware of contact lenses that we wear. But the contact lenses can be tinted and can change how objects appear to us. And the id tints the way we perceive reality. So as to Mark's views on where consciousness is in the brain, I don't think consciousness is in the brain. I see human experience as subject, perception or conception, and object. The subject is a spiritual part of us. That is, it's the way we're created in the image of God as part of our soul. The instrument by which we perceive and conceive is the brain, and we're unconscious. Everything that goes on in the brain to us is unconscious. And the objects we perceive are the things that we're conscious of. So that's kind of the way I see the world. I believe that science can be defined fairly easily, despite all the enormous literature and difficulties people have had. I take the classical philosopher's definition of science, which is that science is the systematic study of natural effects according to their causes. So you systematically study nature, things in nature, and you look for the causes of things in nature. I think God is the ultimate cause of nature and the ultimate cause of us. So I think that understanding God and understanding the spiritual aspects of our soul is a scientific endeavor. And I think if we leave that aspect of us out, our science is incomplete. So that's my view.
Cool. So next I want to talk about the way some of your peers have received your work and beliefs. But first, is there anything you want to respond back to that, Mark? What was just said?
Well, there's a small bit and a big bit. The small and the big bit, I think, goes in the direction that you want to pursue next, about how one's peers respond. But the small bit is this. I just want to clarify something that Michael said. He said, unlike me, he does not believe that consciousness is in the brain. So I want to clarify, I too do not believe that consciousness is in the brain. I believe that we can, looked at from the outside as an object, we see this thing. That thing is not consciousness. It's consciousness is a subjective state. It's a state of being, and you can only register consciousness from the viewpoint of being something. So that's it's an internal, it's a subjective point of view. The objective point of view, the external one, looking at myself in the mirror, as I was saying earlier, there I see a body. Part of that body is my brain. So it's an external manifestation. The consciousness is not there. The consciousness is here. That's looking at it from a different point of view, and it's a very important point because all of these powerful tools we have in neuroscience for imaging the brain, imaging even individual neurons with optogenetics. As they are actively doing their thing that correlates with the mental states. Nevertheless, you will never see a mental state in those neurons or in that scan, because mental states are not objects. They're not things you can see from the outside. You have, and so the subjective perspective, which is greatly neglected in neuroscience, is absolutely fundamental if we're going to address these big questions. Now that leads to the bigger point. The bigger point is if you do address these big questions, you're in trouble. Michael was saying, and Michael, I didn't know that about the origins of your own interest in the brain being so similar to my own. In other words, your own childhood experience of a loved person suffering brain disease and seeing how they're changed by that. It confronts you with profound mysteries. What is the relationship between me and my body? These are fantastically important questions. And so one pursues a career in neuroscience. You would think that's one of the obvious places to go if you're wanting to understand questions like this. But my experience upon entering the graduate program that I did in order to pursue these questions, my professors kindly, they thought, counseled me not to ask questions like this. It's bad for your career, they said, to ask questions like that. And so you get the sense of wonder, the naive wonder, which makes us become scientists and neuroscientists in particular in the first place. You get it beaten out of you. And I'm not sure how many people realize that, that science is an incredibly rigid sort of, it's like a mafia, you have to go along with the rules of the Don, otherwise you've had it. So that's the big thing I wanted to say in response to what Michael was saying. He's speaking about these, what he's expressing is hard-won conclusions that he has come to as a result of struggling with the biggest questions that there are, and it's not universally admired to do that. It's considered, something worse than a maverick. That it's sort of unscientific, even anti-scientific, to express opinions based on the evidence on these big questions. And so when he said, quoting somebody whose name I'm afraid I didn't recognize, that in neuroscience we have tons of answers, but we've forgotten what the questions are. Nothing could be closer to my own experience than that statement.
Right. Yeah, I love that statement. It sums it up so beautifully. And there really is a rigidity and a kind of a cancel culture in science that you can get canceled awfully easily by even asking an inconvenient question. I have a friend who was a very accomplished biologist, neurobiologist, who was a Christian. He's a fairly devout Christian, and we were talking at a meeting some years ago, and he mentioned that he had sympathy, for example, for intelligent design, for non-materialist ways of looking at biology. He said, but he can't say a word about it, not a single word. He said, if he actually said, my wife has health issues, and I need my job, and if I said a word about this, I would never get another grant. It would just be the end of my career. And he's a very, very respected, prominent scientist. There's a terrible, terrible cancel culture in science. I don't yet understand it, really. I don't know why it's so intense. It's among the most intense examples of cancel culture that I've encountered. You really can't express any viewpoint that's outside of a very narrow channel, basically of materialist metaphysics.
So I've observed that in fields of science or, academic, intellectual fields where the rubber hits the road frequently, you don't get that kind of dogmatism and ideological motivation. Like if you're trying to build an airplane or build a bridge Or perhaps a good example is business, because you get business schools where people teach you how to run a successful business who themselves are not running successful businesses. And they will be very dogmatic and tell you things that aren't necessarily true. But if you talk to people who are actually running businesses, they'll try anything that they think might work. They won't be dogmatic, and it's very, on the ground kind of practical. So with regards to science, with neuroscience and treating patients, perhaps you don't get the same degree of dogmatism. But as soon as you want to talk about the bigger questions in life, you might get that kind of dogmatism.
Yeah, and I find that dogmatism becomes more intense, as you've implied, the further you are from real contact with your subject. That is, that scientists who don't actually think about or see patients who have neurological issues are much more likely to be dogmatic about neuroscience. When you actually look carefully into real people's lives and the way they really are with various brain lesions, the dogmatism it kind of melts away. You start to see that there's much more to it. For example, I find that engineers and physicians are generally more open-minded on metaphysical questions about science than basic scientists are. So.
I agree with that. I think that clinical medicine, it's a practical endeavor, and your patients are concerned with what works. And the analogy with engineering that we're using is a good one. It's a practical question. How do you make a bridge that doesn't collapse? Mm-hmm. That's all that counts. The irony is that in science, and we're speaking specifically here about neuroscience, as you approach the bigger questions, the less practical questions, not that they're less important, it's in fact the opposite. You have all these peppercorns of practical matters, and then you say, okay, and then what lies behind that, and what are the deeper laws governing these specific examples, these concrete instances. You're approaching what you would think are the pivotal questions of science, the fundamental questions of science. I said it's ironic. I think it's because as you do so, it becomes less certain. You're dealing with things about which it's not so easy to find the answer. That is why there's the rigidity. That's the irony.
Yes.
It's because people have to start defending positions which are increasingly indefensible as you move further and further away from the concrete surface. And that's the way I've come to look on that. But the reward of not losing sight of these questions is enormous. It's science, as opposed to getting research grants and publications. Science is about the pursuit of these big questions, and it's immensely gratifying to be able to do so. To spend your life on these sorts of questions. We were talking earlier. I'm sorry, forgive me if I'm speaking too much, but we were talking earlier about those childhood events that shaped our careers. And in my case, after my brother's brain injury, and my reflecting on all of the implications of it, how come my brother is his brain? I mean, how can damage to a part of his body have changed him so radically as a person? And am I my brain? How can I be my brain? And if I am my brain, if my brain were to be damaged, what would become of me? And when I die and my brain disintegrates in my grave, where do I go? These are the kinds of questions which every child, I think, just about every child, at some point starts to think. We underestimate, the things that these are pretty basic questions which at some point you're going to ask.
Sure.
And what happened to me was I thought if my brain disappears, then I will disappear. That seems to be the conclusion that one is led to by the evidence of the kind that I was just referring to. And so I fell into a profound depression. I thought there's no point in doing anything. What's the point of having good experiences and doing good deeds and etc., achieving things, leaving them behind, if you're not there to experience it? It's all pointless. So it was a nihilistic despair that I fell into, and that led me to the conclusion. The way I came out of it, was, well, the only thing that is worth doing in the circumstances is to try to understand if all that I am is this brief period of biological being. If that is the case, the only thing worth doing with it is to try and understand, well, what is being? What is it actually? What is it for? What is it about? And so that's what led me into science. And this is why I'm saying it's enormously rewarding to pursue these questions. There's nothing more important. And I feel it every day.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I used to have this fantasy that I would picture myself in a white lab coat in a lab, finding out the mysteries of what life was. That is, that in some way that I would be able to get to the core of these mysteries. And I didn't have any particular interest in the superficial understandings. I didn't want to do butterfly collecting. I didn't want to do that kind of thing. I wanted to find out, what's this all about? Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? What is the world? And I originally thought that I could get a good answer for that in neuroscience. I realized that neuroscience focuses on a narrow part of the truth, and that the deeper truth I find in religion, in philosophy, of which neuroscience is a part. In fact, I think that neuroscience can only be understood deeply and well if one gets one's philosophy right. I don't know if you've read Bennett and Hacker, but Bennett is a neuroscientist, I think, from Australia, and Hacker is a philosopher from Oxford, have written a lot on the philosophy of neuroscience. And one of their favorite expressions, or there are two of their favorite expressions. One is that what we need in neuroscience is conceptual hygiene, they call it. That is, we need to clean up our concepts. We need to understand what we really mean by things. They say that the prerequisite for understanding something is, first of all, you just have to make sense. That what you say has to be a coherent thing to start from. And if what you're starting from is kind of incoherent gibberish, which I think a lot of materialism is, you'll never get the right answer because you're starting from a very weak foundation. So I really like a lot of their work. A good example of this whole thing is that we speak of consciousness all the time. And I've struggled for years with what is consciousness, because so much of our understanding of cognitive neuroscience depends upon what we think consciousness really is. But we're reluctant a lot of times to define it. I have a simple definition, which I think works. Back in the 19th century, Franz Brentano, who's a German philosopher, asked, is there anything that is characteristic of a mental state that is never characteristic of a physical state? Is there any sharp line of cleavage between mental and physical? And he said, yeah, there is. It's intentionality. Which is the capacity for a thought to have an aboutness, to be directed at something. And so my definition of a conscious state is an intentional state. If something is intentional, then it is a mind of some sort. And if something is not intentional, then it's a physical object. And I find that pretty good. I know Mark has written a great deal about subjectivity and feelings and so on. And that obviously is also what consciousness is. And the question is emotion or our feelings or qualia, are they intentional states? I think they are. I think intentionality includes them, although I think there are philosophers who have a different perspective on it. So I define consciousness as intentionality, as the capacity to be about something.
So I'd like to say a couple of things, ending with this question of how I define consciousness. First of all, regarding metaphysics, well, let me put it this way. I'll rather say this first, that I agree about conceptual hygiene, and that we need to be absolutely crystal clear about the philosophical assumptions that we start from. It is really quite astonishing. The mainstream view, the conceptual starting point for the very vast majority of our colleagues, which they don't even realize is a metaphysical position that they're adopting. They just think this is given. The kind of thing that we were talking about earlier, the idea that consciousness resides in the brain. I mean, it is incoherent. It's a completely incoherent idea. But everyone agrees with that more or less, and then they do neuroscience. And how can you come up with sensible findings with respect to big questions if you start with such a nonsensical position and don't even realize that that's what you're doing? You're just following the party line. And so the other thing I wanted to say before coming to my definition of consciousness is that even bigger than that materialist monist position that is so prevalent in our field, is the failure to recognize that science is a sort of a faith, no more or less than what scientists derisively call a religion. There's a faith in science. In other words, a belief. I believe that there's something beyond the data, beyond what I see. There's something behind that, something that explains that can be found. That is just a belief. I have faith that there is some true reality, some true cause that I will, if not find, at least approximate. I will approach it. I'll get closer to it. That is my faith. And I think it's very important to recognize that it comes back to the point about the sense of humility that's needed in science. As to are you ever going to actually get there? No, because you have faith there's something there, and you try and you try and you try again. But now coming to because that's what I've been doing with this question of consciousness. So to come to what do I think? How do I define consciousness? My position is building on what we were discussing earlier when I said, the kind of ABCs of behavioral neuroscience is you say, let me damage this part and let me damage that part, and let's see when the lights go out, the lights go out with reticulate brainstem damage. And so then the question becomes, what is that part of the brain doing? And remember, all the time I'm framing this within a dual aspect monist. I'm saying, look at from the outside, what can I infer? Because from the inside, there's nothing going on if you damage that area. So from the outside, let's have a look what that area does. And when it was first discovered by Magoon and Maruzzi, in 1949, to their very great surprise, that consciousness is lost with damage to this ancient, primitive, small little part of the brain. The way in which they retained the old view that consciousness is a cortical function was to say, well, this part of the brain is responsible for the level of consciousness, for the quantitative, how much consciousness is there. The thing we measure with the Glasgow Coma scale, on a sort of 15 points, do you have 15, 14, 13? How much consciousness is there? And they said the cortex, by contrast, is responsible for its contents, the actual qualitative, phenomenal stuff of experience. And a good analogy to illustrate the point that Magoon and Maruzzi made, and which everyone has followed ever since, is that of a television set plugged into a power source, an electrical socket. They say, well, of course, it's a prerequisite for a television set to produce televisual content that it has to be powered up. You need to plug it in. But that doesn't mean that television really comes from the electrical socket. That really what explains everything about television is electricity. They say it's nonsense. It's just the power source. It's just a necessary precondition. That's how the brainstem was viewed from 1949 onwards. The reticular activating system is the power supply for the brain. Now, that's the thing that I've been led to conclude is wrong. And again, I'll just refer to the evidence we've spoken about already. Those little kids with no cortex at all, the brainstem is fine, and they're conscious, and they have feelings. So that part of the brain doesn't just supply power, it supplies a content and a quality, which we call feeling. And I think, there's much more evidence that I could cite. I'm trying to just keep things simple. There's lots of other evidence leading to the same conclusion, that the most rudimentary foundational form of consciousness is raw feeling. So for me, my definition of consciousness is feeling. In its most, then we can feel our way into our cognitions and become conscious of them. But consciousness is feeling.
Would you say that's qualia, Mark? Is that
yes?
Yeah.
Yes, because the qualia that are conventionally cited, is the redness of red, or the sound of middle C. That the quality, the phenomenal stuff, and feelings clearly have quality. They have a phenomenal stuff. There is something it is like to have a feeling. So yes, they're qualia. Now, I don't think that the whole of consciousness is just raw feeling. I'm saying that the most elementary, basic form of consciousness is raw feeling, and from that we can then go on to ask all sorts of questions about, well, then what is it for? Why do we? What does consciousness add to everything else that the brain and the body do? But the question as to whether or not that is intentional in Brentano's sense. Are feelings intentional? Are they about something? I think very much so. Feelings are about how well you do it in terms of the most basic requirements of life. You need to stay within certain viable bounds in respect of your core body temperature, your blood gas balance, your hydration in relation to salt and so on. And if you deviate from those, you feel thirsty, or you feel too hot, or you feel respiratory distress, air hunger, and these feelings tell you, this is bad. And if you take corrective action, the right sort of corrective action, you feel good. And so, yes, this I must do, this I must not do. And I think that that's the absolutely the bedrock of what consciousness is for. It is for us to know how we're doing within a scale of values in which it is good to stay alive and bad to die.
Sure. And I think the question that lies underneath this, that David Chalmers has talked about, that a number of philosophers have talked about, is obviously the hard problem of consciousness and the easy problems of consciousness. And not that neuroscience, of course, is anything easy. It's actually very difficult, but it's tractable. And I remain fascinated by the question is, who is it that has the feelings? So what is the subject in all of this? I don't think the subject is or can be the brain or a part of the brain. I don't even think that would be intelligible, that the subject is subjective, not objective. And I honestly think that one has to look to religion to get a feeling for what the substance or of what the subject is. And what has fascinated me as of late is a passage in the 3rd chapter of Exodus, a very famous passage where Moses encounters the burning bush. And he asks this God speaking out of the burning bush, because this was a time of polytheism where there were thousands of gods, what this God's name was. And God answered, I am is my name. I am. And if you think about it, the subject in all of this talk about consciousness is a little I am. And it's not the capital I am, it's the small case I am. And in Genesis, it says that we are created in God's image. So I really think that the I am, the subject of consciousness, is part of our soul that is created by God. And I think that's the scientific truth. I think it's a truth in science, and I can't understand neuroscience without including that in it. And I do believe that the brain obviously plays a central role in consciousness and cognition and all of that. I believe that the brain, the functions of the brain are pretty much what Freud ascribed to the id and the superego. I think more or less the brain is the id, the whole brain. And the subject, the ego that actually consciously perceives and conceives, is the little I am, the little part of us that is created in God's image and is part of our soul.
So you're mentioning Freud quite a bit, and our audience might wonder why are you doing that. So let me just clarify. Michael's being generous to me by referring to Freud all the time, because because of my frustration with the neuroscience that I was taught in the 1980s, bearing in mind why I came into the field, I was terribly disappointed that there was, these big questions were simply not addressed, and you were reprimanded for raising them. As I said earlier, I was told it's bad for my career. I mustn't ask questions like that. So I looked around and tried to find somewhere else that I could. So Michael was drawn to biblical texts as a more inspiring source of answers than the lab. I was drawn to psychoanalysis because, with all of its faults, and I have to say, psychoanalysis has many faults. Yes. Its strength is that its starting point is subjective experience and the being of the mind, and the lived life of the mind, and taking that as your subject matter, and then saying, okay, let's try and understand this. So I jumped ship. Well, I shouldn't say I jumped ship, because I didn't abandon neuroscience. But I was working in the Department of Neurosurgery in the Royal London Hospital by day, and by night I was at the Institute of Psychoanalysis training as a psychoanalyst, like Jekyll and Hyde. And so this is why Michael is referring to Freud all the time. He's trying to build a bridge to my language, because that's I then try to bring this conceptual framework into neuroscience. It provided us with a language, with concepts, with methods, tools for being able to take seriously the subjective being of the mind. Which, as Michael keeps reminding us, and I agree with him completely, the mind is, it's subjective. It's a being. It's the being of the thing. It's not an object. It's not an organ. It's not a physical thing. So I try to bring that perspective into neuroscience. I then, having built that bridge, of course, it's a two-way street, and I then also try to bring neuroscientific methods to bear on psychoanalytical theoretical claims, and have tried to build a truly psychological neuroscience, one that takes seriously the subjective nature of the mind on this basis. So those are the concepts I use. But, I want to reiterate what I said earlier, that these are concepts. These are abstractions. These are vehicles. These are words that we use to try. So you speak of the soul, and then you speak of the id. These are words. I'm constantly reminding myself that these are attempts to grasp something which I don't believe I will ever completely grasp. So I'm deeply respectful of people of other faiths. Remember, I think science is a faith. Of other faiths, I think that we're all trying to do the same thing. I don't share that language. I'm not a religious person, but I am not an atheist. I'm agnostic about such things, and I'm trying my best to understand, trying my best to come to grips with these deep mysteries. I think that what you're alluding to, Michael, without saying it, or I'm pretty sure it is in your mind, is the where does life come from? And the difference between living things and non-living things is, I use the word very advisedly, it's miraculous. It's completely miraculous that this form of organization, this what you spoke of intentionality as in the other sense of the word. The intentional in the philosophical sense, as Michael said, it refers to aboutness. But in the colloquial sense, that there's an aim and a purpose. That this is what living things have, an aim and a purpose. Right. You can't make sense of anything about even the simplest living creatures, like single-celled organisms, without recognizing that they have an aim and a purpose, which is we don't make enough of that. It's something that we kind of airbrush out in biology, and I think that we need to have more of a sense of wonder about these things. I'm repeating myself, but that's because from every direction you end up coming back to the same conclusion.
One of the things that has led me to a religious perspective, and I certainly didn't start out that way. I was an atheist, or at most an agnostic, until I was in my mid-40s, and I had several experiences that changed me, including kind of a Damascus Road experience, but also an intellectual experience, or a bunch of intellectual experiences. I found that in thinking about science and thinking about neuroscience and about other kinds of science, physics and so on, that first of all, I noticed that the Aristotelian framework for metaphysics made so much sense. It made so much more sense than otherwise. So even Cartesian dualism to me didn't make a lot of sense. But the Aristotelian hylomorphic framework fit science and particularly fit neuroscience like a glove. I was so impressed. And then I studied St. Thomas more, because St. Thomas kind of took a lot of Aristotle's ideas and developed them further. And they were both theists, St. Thomas obviously, but even Aristotle believed in God. And my intellectual embrace of theism kind of came out of that I realized that the hylomorphic Aristotelian-Thomistic metaphysical way of looking at the world really made sense of things in a way that nothing else did. And then I followed their reasoning to, well, hylomorphism points to God. So it intellectually it clicked for me, and it still does. I find it kind of one fabric, that God exists, created us, and the universe behaves as it does in accordance with that truth. So, but the truth is reflected in neuroscience and in all the science.
So the funny thing is that motivated as I was by puzzling about these profound questions, the particular one at issue being, how come I am a body? What is the relationship between me, this subjective being, and this object? Puzzling about it, pondering it, looking at the question in relation to neuroscientific observations and so on, I was eventually led in the mid 1990s. In fact, I wrote a paper about it in 97 to this view that I sketched in a very rough and ready way some minutes ago. Which is that there are two appearances. Behind which lies the actual thing called Mark Solms. He is neither his subjective experience nor is he his body. He's something that unites the two and that lies behind both surfaces. And he is not just the appearance. He's something deeper than that. That view which I came to, I was then sort of surprised and disappointed to discover this was not some great insight that I had forged. It was an ancient philosophy that belongs to Spinoza, or that was articulated most clearly initially by Spinoza. And you will know better than anyone, Michael, Spinoza's view on the sorts of theistic questions that you are touching on. He was a deeply spiritual man.
Yes,
and he saw all of this as that. This we are of God. We are all of us. The whole universe, is the expression of God. So the philosophy that I came to is not far removed from the traditions that you are drawing.
Right.
Used in that sense, the concept of God, in that sense, that seems entirely appropriate to me. As opposed to the concept of God that my parents taught me about, an old wise man with a beard. I think as long as one gets that idea out of one's head, then I think that you're speaking with an appropriately reverential word for that which gave rise to everything and explains everything.
Sure. One of the things I really love about Thomism is that it rather nicely combines the sort of what I totally agree, the profundity of Spinoza's insights, and I have a lot of respect for Spinoza, and I point out that he's been the inspiration for a lot of scientists. Einstein commented that the God he believed in was Spinoza's God. So Spinoza fits very nicely into natural science, and I think Spinoza had a lot of very deep insights. The the Thomistic view fits in with that, I think, in many very nice ways. But I think where Spinoza and I would diverge, and St. Thomas would diverge, is that Spinoza, I don't believe, saw God as a person. That Spinoza's God was an impersonal being, and my own view is that God is the ultimate person. That the ultimate reality. I think Spinoza saw the ultimate reality as like a mind, and St. Thomas saw the ultimate reality as like a person. St. Augustine had a wonderful way of looking at this, and he said that we and all of reality are thoughts in God's mind, which answers Plato's problem of forms very, very nicely. That Plato obviously posited that there were forms which were ideals of the way things were in the world, and they existed in a perfect state somewhere, but nobody could really say where. And St. Augustine said these are ideas in God's mind, and we are ideas in God's mind. I think of myself as a Thomistic idealist. That is, that I think idealism as a philosophy is quite respectable. Berkeleyan idealism is a very good way of looking at the world. But I think that the structure in God's mind is Thomist. So kind of humorously, I like to say that we are thoughts in God's mind, and God is a Thomist. That kind of sums it up. But I think you can't leave ultimate explanations out of science. And I think that subjectivity, the fact that I'm a person and not just an object, cries out for some kind of ultimate explanation. And for me, the Christian Thomistic explanation is the one that makes the most sense.
I'm familiar with that statement of Einstein's that I believe in Spinoza's God, and there's another statement of Einstein's which I love to cite, which I think is very pertinent to the discussion we are having right now, which is when he said that it's important to simplify as much as possible, but no more than that.
Right.
And I think that these questions that we are talking about, one must have a proper respect for how complex they are, and we should not simplify beyond the level of what is appropriate. And also, I'm aware that Spinoza got himself into trouble with the church on the point that you just mentioned. That he saw God as impersonal. But I find I'm going to now ask you a question, and it is a sincere question. I really am asking you from ignorance. I have difficulty understanding the difference between Spinoza's view and the other thing that you said about us. I think you said it was St. Augustine's view that we are ideas in God's mind.
Yes.
I don't see why? Well, let me put it more concretely. What do you mean when you say that you don't think that God is a state of being, but rather a person? What is the difference between the two? What is lacking in Spinoza's view?
That's a great and profound question, and an extremely difficult question. And it is a question that I think St. Thomas addressed, and many of the ancient theologians had addressed in a way. And the question is, how can we understand God? That is, we acknowledge, you and I and many people, that there is something like God that is the origin of existence, be it Spinoza's God or St. Thomas's or St. Augustine's God. And the question is then, how can we understand him? What can we know about him? And it was the view of Boethius, who's a theologian some centuries before Aquinas, that we could know nothing directly about God because God is transcendent. It would be like a bacterium knowing about Einstein. There's just a disconnect there. But St. Thomas and Boethius said that there were some things that we could know about God, that God is not totally unknowable. The first thing we can know about God is we can know what he is not. That is, that God is not a piece of matter. He's not finite. He's not evil. He's not mortal. There are things that we can make reasonable assumptions about what he is not. We can know about God by his effects, by what's created in the world. And with the assumption being that whatever is created in the world is in some way an aspect of God that is reflected in his creation. And we can know about God by analogy. That is, that we can say, for example, that God is infinitely powerful, although the term power really can't describe something that is transcendent. Power is something that we understand in our universe, but he is like something that was infinitely powerful. So when you look at the effects of God in the world, and I think the most remarkable effect is our personhood, our subjectivity, the fact that we are persons, leads me, and I think has led a lot of theologians to say that's because God is a person. That's where our personhood comes from. We're the small case I am, and he is the big case I am. So I think Spinoza had a lot of things very right, and I think there's a lot of consilience between his view of God as sort of being in everything and St. Augustine's view that we are in God. But I think that the fact that we are persons means that God is a person, and that we are created in his image as persons.
I see. Thank you very much. That really does clarify it. And I don't mean only that, it clarifies a technical question for me. I think that that's a very profound point. And I'm grateful to you for clarifying that.
Thank you.
I too think of myself as an idealist in the sense, I've already told you that I'm a dual aspect monist, but those dual aspects, both of them are experienced.
Yes.
I am a transcendental idealist, a Kantian, if you will, except that I'm also interested in the not only in things but in subjects, and by the way, Freud took that view too. He said that he's taking the perspective upon the mind that Kant taught us to take upon things. That our experience of our own subject, of our own being, is not our being in itself. We are aware of we have the phenomena of subjective experience, behind which is a noumenal reality. And I am sympathetic. I am of the same view. It appears as you when you say it's not unknowable. To say that you cannot know it completely because you are forever trapped in the envelope of experience. You can't transcend your own experience. But you do believe, I say again, have faith that there is something beyond your experience. And that is, for me, the starting point of science, is that you are trying to understand something of this ultimately. Ultimately, I mean, in its entirety, it is not knowable by a mere human mind. But that doesn't mean that you say, "Well, I know nothing." You say, "Well, let me try my best." So what you've just articulated I think is very consistent with that. You're saying, well, there's certain inferences we can draw about what lies behind it all, and what you've just explained now about, you've said God is not finite, God is not a thing, God is not bad. And by the same sort of reasoning, that God is a person, I understand that, and I agree with you that we can make. When I said earlier that scientists should have humility about what they can and can't know, I certainly don't mean to reify ignorance in saying that.
Oh, no, yeah, right. I mean, humility is vitally important. I very much believe that inference to God's existence and to the nature of God and so on is very much a scientific question. I don't believe that there is any cleavage point between science and God in the sense of understanding. The reason I believe that is that St. Thomas, the cornerstone of his metaphysics was the absolute distinction between existence and essence. What St. Thomas said was that the fact that something exists is very different from what that thing is. That is that, for example, I could describe my next door neighbor in as much detail as you want, but that doesn't tell you whether he actually exists or not. That existence is not a property of something. It's a separate thing, completely separate thing. And for that reason, St. Thomas believed, for example, that the ontological proof of God's existence, from St. Anselm, the proof that God is the greatest thing we can imagine, it's greater to exist than not to exist, therefore God must exist, was not a valid proof of God's existence, because it had nothing to do with existence in it. That is, there was no evidence in it. There was no actual evidence from nature. And St. Thomas said the only way you can prove God's existence or demonstrate his existence is to use evidence from nature. And you use evidence from nature, and then you, by logical inference, you draw the most reasonable conclusion. That's the basis for his 5 ways. But if you think about it, that's what science is. Science is drawing evidence from nature and making logical conclusions about what makes the most sense of that. And so I think that God's existence is a completely scientific question. Absolutely scientific.
Well, I agree with you entirely. Yeah. And this is also why it's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you, because there are very few scientists who will dare to discuss such things. Right. I have the pleasure of having a close colleague in Cape Town, which is the University of Cape Town is my home base, although at the moment I'm in Berlin. He's a physicist. You might know him, George Ellis.
Yes, I know of him. Yeah.
Yes, and he's a cosmologist, he sees it as you've just articulated it to me, and he has. I'm totally in agreement with him that this is a scientific question. And for a cosmologist, you might think, well, yeah, that's a pretty good science to be pursuing if you're interested in such questions. But you're citing ancient thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, and less ancient ones. We've spoken about Spinoza and Kant and Freud and so on, all of whom are addressing these very questions, in their own way. It brings to mind a phrase which I don't know whose it is. It's not my own. It's a phrase that I read somewhere. Somebody speaking of the arrogance of the present. Right. that we must beware the arrogance of the present. And
I think it was C.S. Lewis, I believe.
Oh, is it? Okay. Well, thanks for putting me out of my misery.
That's right.
Because what what we are both saying, but I think you more clearly than I, is that these questions of science, contemporary science, they are questions which every human mind that's capable of it has been exercised by, and we're probing exactly the same questions. And when you take the trouble, I mean, even within science, when you take the trouble to read the papers of your predecessors, I don't mean read some summary in a textbook, some caricature, but rather actually read their papers. You realize, this is somebody like me. They're pondering this. They're just as clever as me. In fact, cleverer in many respects, in many instances. And so I think this thing about the arrogance of the present. I think we have a very great deal to gain by reading and continuing to take seriously the conclusions that a lifetime of effort of these great minds were led to, recognizing that ultimately we're all in the same boat. We're all trying to solve the same puzzles and mysteries. And we have a great deal to learn from those who have come before us and struggled with these things. And we don't do it in science. I mean, in science, it's kind of, I mean, it's absurd. You must not cite papers that are more than 5 years old.
Right.
Let alone 500 years old.
And the worst thing about it is not simply that I think that the metaphysical basis for much of modern science is quite weak, but that it's not even, most scientists aren't aware that it's a metaphysical basis, and they're not aware that it's weak. And if you bring it up, you get canceled. So it's sad. It's very sad. I mean, some people have pointed out that if you look at all the great science, at least in physics, that took place in the 19th and 20th century, or even going back to Newton, we seem to, at least in physics, have stalled a bit. That there in the last 50, 70 years, there haven't been the kind of profound insights that the pioneers in quantum mechanics had, that Einstein had in relativity, or that Maxwell had in electromagnetism and so on. And I really wonder if this materialist censorship that's kind of come over science is slowing us down. It's kind of preventing people from thinking more deeply about things. So as I said, that's why I find that your neuroscience is so refreshing, because you're thinking about the real questions, and it's really very nice.
I think one interesting question we can ask, we talked about what consciousness is. Maybe we can talk about what matter is, because in terms of what's holding back physics and ways these questions that can be shut down by the group think that goes on in scientific communities. There's this idea that, it's just matter. Matter explains that. Matter this, So, like in Krishna consciousness, we talk about God having inconceivable potencies. And Devaramrita Swami, one Hare Krishna thinker, says that atheists, the materialist scientists, they attribute inconceivable potency to matter. They think matter has all these magical powers, like it can produce consciousness and, all these magical forces. So often, matter will just be given as an explanation for some phenomenon or something. That's explained by matter, but it's like as if that answers the question and there's no further questions to be asked. Perhaps you guys can comment.
I must be careful not to exceed my credentials. I'm not a physicist, but even I, as a non-physicist, can say that it is astonishing that, as you've just said, that this is such a widespread view. It links, with what Michael was saying earlier about scientists not having very poor metaphysics and not even realizing that they're starting from metaphysical assumptions of any kind, let alone questionable ones. But when it comes to matter, it's really a very long time now in physics bearing in mind that I'm not a physicist, but even I know it's really been a long time now in physics that the idea that matter is a fundamental concept has been transcended. I mean, Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, makes the point.
Right.
That matter is derivative. It's a state of energy, this naive idea, that the fundamental stuff is matter. 100 years ago, we realized in physics that that's not true. I think the next really big development beyond relativity and the basic insights of quantum physics that Michael was referring to is Claude Shannon's insight about information. Information in neuroscience, this is a crucial concept. And it's very hard to think about quantum physics, to think in quantum physics, and the big questions that are unsolved that flow from it, without the concept of information, which I hasten to draw your attention to the fact it's not matter.
Right.
I'm not a materialist for exactly that reason. And when it comes to the mind-body relationship, as I said at the very beginning of this conversation, I'm not a materialist. I don't believe that the mind can be reduced to matter, matter is an appearance. If you're wanting to make connections between mind and body and see them both as appearances, then you can't be a materialist. And so
Sure.
These sorts of we must always remember, as I keep saying, that these are concepts, these are abstractions, these are inferences, these are words that we use to try to articulate these profound things. And I think that among those tools, the concept of information, in the sense that Shannon introduced it into physics in 1948, has not yet begun to the implications, the importance, the value of this concept has not begun to fully reveal itself.
The information concept, which I agree is absolutely fascinating, dovetails very nicely with what a number of philosophers of science have pointed out, particularly Bruce Gordon, who's an idealist, who's a brilliant guy, as a philosopher of science, who's a friend of mine. And Bruce points out that when you look at the quantum world, matter doesn't exist. Nothing in the quantum world is matter. Schrodinger's equation has no matter in it. That everything in the quantum world is form, in some sense. And of course, information is, I think, just a modern word for form. So that what really exists is form. Matter, I think, is best understood in the Aristotelian way. And Aristotle saw matter in a very different way than we moderns do. Aristotle asked the fundamental question, what can we know about something? That is, if you have a thing that's in front of you, what can you know about it? He said there are two things that you can know about it. You can know everything that's intelligible about it, and that its size, its shape, its construction, it's everything that you can figure out by studying it. And he called that the principle of intelligibility, and he called that form. And he said, but you could have two identical things that were intelligibly the same thing, but they were differentiated. So he called matter the principle of differentiation, that is, or of individuation, actually, that matter is what makes something intelligible into something individual. And he saw the intelligibility as the actuality of things, and the individuation as the matter of them. But he didn't see matter as like a hard substance. He saw matter as individuation, and even on a deeper level, he saw matter as potency. as possibility and form as actuality. And Heisenberg noted, Heisenberg was a pretty good philosopher. He really had a very good grasp of philosophy. And he noted that Aristotle anticipated quantum mechanics in a lot of ways. For example, Aristotle's view of potency and act, that is, that things exist in potential states until they are observed and they become actual when they're observed, which actually comes from Aristotle, is very much the concept of collapse of the quantum waveform described in quantum mechanics. So Heisenberg said that the reason we think that quantum mechanics is so strange is because we forgot Aristotle. Aristotle wouldn't find quantum mechanics strange at all. And I think where we went wrong in this was with Descartes. I think Descartes made the big mistake of moving away from Aristotelian hylomorphic metaphysics and his notion of res cogitans and res extensa, of everything in nature is kind of like a machine extended in space, except for the spirit, the human mind, which is this kind of ghost thing. Whatever its value is understanding the human mind, it's not good metaphysics. So Aristotelian metaphysics, I think, explains matter very nicely in its potency. Its potency and its individuation, but it's not just hard balls of stuff. So,
yeah, that's the position that you just expressed there and attributed to Aristotle. I must tell you, not only am I not a physicist, I'm also not a philosopher. So forgive my ignorance. I did not know that, but it sounds like you cite Heisenberg, but it sounds like John Wheeler, who's another physicist that we haven't mentioned, who I think is very pertinent to the topic that we're discussing. Especially with respect to information, to how what matter fundamentally is, and there were two other points that came to mind now listening to you. The one was the when you speak about intelligibility and form, the what we forget. I mean, people think of information. In a kind of digital computer sort of, I think they have a very crude sense of what one means by information. And when you read Shannon's paper, and again, as I say, I always find it very valuable to go back and actually read what my forebears wrote. The title of his paper is A Mathematical Theory of Communication, not of information. And by communication, well, let me just cut to the chase. What we forget is that information doesn't exist without there being a question. The information is an answer to, and this perhaps goes back to what you were saying earlier about personhood and some of the other profound matters that we were touching on. The information is only meaningful in the sense that it is an answer to a question, and then the issue becomes, well, where does question asking come from? And there's a line of thought there which I'm just indicating, which I'm not going down, because I want to touch on this other point that you raised about individuation and the coming into being of things. As you know, because you've read my book, this is something that exercises me very much. How do things come about? And I found, building on William Ross Ashby's work, is the work in our time of Carl Friston. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he is, I don't hesitate for a moment to call him a genius. Mm-hmm. And he's written a very brilliant monograph very recently, the last couple of years, called A Particular Physics, in which he addresses this question about how, particularly in the sense of particle, how do things come about? And he draws he draws not only upon Ashby's work on how self-organization works, but in the process draws also on the work of Markov and the concept of Markov blankets. Mm-hmm. How the Markov blanket defines what is and what is not part of the system, and that I found an extremely valuable concept in my quest to understand what is being, as I said in the beginning of our conversation, and recognizing it's not something material. Then you need other concepts for defining how do you specify the individuating of something if it's something, if the principle that you're looking for has to be deeper than something material, something which explains the material. This concept of a Markov blanket was very useful and helpful to me because it's an abstract. It's a way of defining how things like my body and myself both are expressions of some deeper underlying principle the Markov blanket is an abstract concept of how we can think of thingness without having to be so concrete and materialistic about it.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. I saw your reference to it in your book, and I intend to read it because I'm not acquainted with Friston's work, but I very much want to read it. It's on my to-do list. So thank you.
Great. And are you familiar with John Wheeler?
I'm familiar with him as a great physicist. I don't know a lot about his philosophical perspectives. And it's funny that so many of the physicists in that era, Wheeler was a little after Heisenberg and so on, but so many of them, Schrodinger, Einstein, Bohr, all those guys, they were pretty good philosophers. They had some very, very deep insights. Yeah. And when you look at some of the modern physicists, like, for example, Hawking, I think was a terrible philosopher. I mean, he wrote good popular science, but his philosophy was really nothing. Weinberg, who just passed away recently, wrote some very good books, but his philosophical insights weren't all that deep. It seems it's kind of a shame that I think the philosophical depth, at least in physics, has really gone down.
Well, then you're in for a treat if you're not familiar with Wheeler's philosophical.
Oh, good. Okay.
He was a student of Bohr's.
Right.
Was Wheeler.
Mm-hmm.
But also my friend George Ellis, he's a physicist who's got a proper philosophical mind.
Yeah, and which I think is a proper scientific mind, meaning that
yes,
you really can't do good science without grappling with these questions, because all science depends on these questions. And if you don't even know the questions, then your science is really built on a weak foundation. So it's great.
Agreed. So I don't know what time it is for you. It's now 9:45 at night here in Germany, and I'm starting to get hungry. Speaking of the viable bounds of an organism.
It's a bit late for dinner.
Yes, exactly. So my mind is beginning to drift towards the kitchen.
I was just chatting with a friend last night who grew up in Argentina, and in their culture, they eat dinner at about midnight, pretty typically. They went and visited their family a little while back, and they had dinner at 10 o'clock to be courteous to their guests who are used to having dinner earlier.
Yes. Well, and then what they do is not just have a little snack. I mean, when they say they have dinner, they mean it.
Right. Cool. So that was a really fascinating discussion. I'm honored to have been a fly on the wall for this. And I hope to have more in the future. Thanks for coming on. Are there any final words either of you would like to say?
Well, I would like to say, I think I've said it in en passant, but I want to say it now in conclusion. I really have learned a good deal from talking with you, Michael, and I've enjoyed it enormously. Thank you so much for initiating this.
Thank you, Mark. And I've learned a great deal from you as well, from your outstanding book, The Hidden Spring, and from talking with you. It's a real pleasure. So I feel like kind of like a kindred soul.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
I put a link to the book in the description. So it's highly recommended by both me and Michael. I put a link to where you can find Michael Egnor's blog too in the video description, so you can check that out. This video was actually suggested by a comment on YouTube. Somebody told me I should get Mark Solms on to have a discussion with Michael Egnor. So thanks for that, YouTube commenter. And if you've got other ideas, you can throw them out, and I'll see what I can do. If you like this sort of stuff, be sure to subscribe, give us a like to help us in the algorithm. Let us know what you think down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Hare Krishna.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Regina.
Bye-bye now.